Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 5 books that have changed my life. They're not my favourite books, they're not like the best written books I've ever read, they're not the books I've read the most, but they are definitely 5 books that have changed the way I see the world and the way I think about things, and I would definitely recommend reading all of them. Timestamps in the description if you would like to skip around, otherwise let's get straight into it. Okay, so book number 1 is The Selfish Gene. And this is kind of the book that helped me rediscover science when I was in my early 20s. It's really well written, it simplifies technical concepts in a way that are really digestible and memorable, and at the time it came out, it was actually really groundbreaking stuff. Some of the concepts that it introduced at the time we now understand are a little bit more complex than Richard Dawkins thought when he wrote it, but that's kind of how science works. Things evolve and grow, and I'm certain Richard Dawkins would be delighted that science has moved on in the time since he wrote this book. So his basic argument is that evolution is best understood at the genetic rather than the organism level. So when you consider how genes manifest themselves inside larger organisms, how they ensure their own survival, and how they can actually program our brains and behaviours, a lot of evolutionary behaviours make more sense. So in the selfish gene theory, the only measure of success is how much a gene gets passed on, not how long the animal lives or how happy it is or even where it sits on the food chain. And sort of counterintuitively, the selfish gene theory also helps to explain altruism, or why one animal would sacrifice or hurt itself to help another one. In the traditional way of thinking about evolution that held out at the time this book came out, it wouldn't make much sense for animals to sacrifice themselves, because obviously they would be hurting themselves, they would be hurting their chances of reproductive success. But in the selfish gene theory, if sacrificing yourself helps pass your genes on in the form of offspring or a whole ton of nieces or nephews, or even worker bee drones, then that's a reproductively successful strategy. So that's all really interesting, but Dawkins also uses this book to talk about things like game theory and the trolley problem, which were concepts that I had no idea about when I first read it, and which are really helpful models for understanding the world. But I think the single thing that made this book so valuable to me is how much Dawkins talks about selection pressure and replicators as being a really important concept to understand for your overall understanding of the world. Dawkins was actually the guy who came up with the term meme to get across the idea of a chunk of information. And although we now think of memes as images with text on or just funny GIFs, the term's supposed to be broad enough to convey almost any kind of information. So any idea is really a meme, and the success or failure of that idea is how kind of reproductively successful it is. So if a cult does well, that's because it has qualities that make it good at reproducing itself, like its ideas are very appealing, or they're very easy for other people to remember and pass on. And you can even see brands and companies as replicators. They all have a certain set of behaviours and qualities that make them more and less likely to survive. And if the environment they're trying to survive in changes, then suddenly they have to either adapt to that kind of evolutionary pressure, or they won't be as successful at thriving and replicating anymore. So a fantastic book about biology, really interesting insight into a process that I feel like everyone should understand, but also a great way to look at the world and understand a whole bunch of different concepts better. Definitely read The Selfish Gene, I love it. Okay, my next book is How to Make Friends and Influence People. And this is one of these books that gets recommended so often that you're probably wondering why anyone needs to recommend it again. But quite honestly, I was pretty socially awkward until my mid-20s, and this was one of those books that I kind of put off reading because the title seems a little bit manipulative, oh, you're going to influence people. But actually, it's a classic for a reason, and that's because it's not really manipulative at all. What it's doing is teaching you the nuts and bolts of human interaction that a lot of people just learn naturally by that age in their lives, but some people don't. And if you haven't had that head start, it's a book that you should absolutely read. So the chapter headings are stuff like, do this and you'll be welcome anywhere. How to make people like you instantly. How to spur people on to success. Make the faults seem easy to correct. And making people glad to do what you want. And the advice is stuff like, be a good listener. Encourage other people to talk about themselves. Become genuinely interested in other people. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. Make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. And even from that little overview, you would probably notice that the words honesty, sincerity, and truthfulness come up a lot. And that is because it is fundamentally a book about becoming a nice person, not just pretending to be one. And a whole ton of books have come after this, and a lot of them are about what you would call social engineering, here's a little trick to make people like you. But the Carnegie has stood the test of time for a reason, and I think that is because you genuinely can't fake this stuff. You can't fake being an interesting, nice person to be around. You have to be a nice, interesting person to be around. And reading the Carnegie is one of the best first steps you can take towards doing that. Okay, so book number 3 is Never Let Go. And although this is a book that's kind of about lifting heavy and getting strong, it's actually really a book about life and philosophy. It's by Dan John, and as well as being a renowned strength coach, he's also a former competitive discus thrower and Highland Games athlete, so he is a guy who knows a lot about getting strong. And when I first started getting serious about strength training in my late 20s, I was really lucky that this was one of the first books I happened across. There's a bunch of specific advice on like actual workouts you can do, how to put your own workouts together, but there's also a lot in it that influenced the way I think about stuff like willpower, how I think about like the grind harder mindset that a lot of people adopt in their early 20s, and just how I think about training in general. So really, the simpler you can make your program while still getting results, the better a coach you are. And Dan is a really good coach. Dan was basically the originator of a lot of training concepts you still see now. So he helped popularize the overhead squat. He basically invented the goblet squat. He really condenses the information down into what you need to know. So one of my favorite parts is his classic top 10 tips for athletes, which includes stuff like use whole body lifts, rarely isolate a muscle, constantly strive to add weight to the bar and move it faster. The best anabolic is water. Did you eat breakfast? If you didn't, don't ask me about nutrition. But then he also gives more general advice about cultivating a love of the sport you're in. So read everything and watch everything you can about your sport. Travel to a lot of meets. Hang out with your competition for long periods afterwards. One of my favourite lines in the book is, I can tell everything about your training by what you do first. And that really resonates with me. Like, I see a whole bunch of people doing 1,000 different exercises before they even get to the good stuff. But Dan is like, get in, warm up, do your front squats, and you will see the gains come. There's some interesting quirky advice in here, like I tried making the slosh pipe Dan recommends. I've tried some Litvinov sprints, which are absolutely killer. I think this is where I got the idea of the IWT, the interval weight training, from, which is just nasty if you've ever tried it. There's a whole bunch of stuff to just try and learn. But what makes the book so good is that Dan doesn't overcomplicate anything. He talks about strength training and fitness in a way that makes you think this isn't just a 12-week program or something to do to get ripped for the beach. It's something I can do for the rest of my life and keep myself in great physical shape. A part I love towards the end of the book is where Dan talks about how his long-term goals have changed from like throwing the discus for a state record to being able to get off the toilet unassisted on the last day he's alive. And if you don't think that's a valid goal, then you're probably just not old enough to understand it yet. So Never Let Go, fantastic book. If you're at all interested in strength training, you should have read it already. If you're interested in health and longevity, you should probably read it right now. I'm not sure I recommend doing the Litvinovs. Okay. The Story of Art is a little bit bigger than the other books that I'm recommending today. And this is a book I only read quite recently. And basically, I've always liked looking at art, and I've always been able to find kinds of art that I like. But I've never really felt like I understood art or had a way of putting all the different types of art into some kind of overall context. And so a few years ago, I decided to change that, which is why I read The Story of Art, which a lot of people recommend as the best introduction to the overall medium. And yeah, it's amazing. So it starts with cave paintings, and then it moves on to things like why hieroglyphics look the way they do, which is essentially because they were concerned with conveying good information rather than looking nice. And at every stage, Gombrich does a great job of summarizing kind of what he's already told you and what's going on in the current chapter. And he explains things in the context of the history of the time. So for instance, in medieval art, you were trying to communicate like religious stories to a population that largely couldn't read. So these religious stories had to be told as clearly and simply as possible. And anything that diverted attention from what was considered like a sacred aim at the time would be taken out of the picture, which explains a lot about the art styles of the time and helps you understand them better. There are great explanations of apprenticeship systems, how art evolved, when things like foreshortening became concerns, why art sometimes seemed to move forward and then take a step back, why some styles of art have survived and others haven't, and the roots of the original modern art movement. One side note, The Story of Art was first published in 1950, so its analysis does stop with early modern art. And if you want to kind of pick up the story and get to the present day, I really recommend this by Will Gompertz, which is also just a fantastic read that kind of takes you the rest of the way. And yeah, it's just an amazing book. If any painting gets mentioned in any kind of detail, there's a big full colour reproduction of it inside. It never really outstays its welcome on any one topic, and Gombrich does his absolute best to convey everything in super simple, understandable terms. There's no like jargon or artsy pretentiousness in this book. Something I've talked about in another video is how important it is to build a trunk of knowledge to hang facts off in any area that you're trying to learn more about. And honestly, the story of art is a fantastic way to do that in the art world. I cannot recommend it enough. Okay, so the final book I want to talk about today is Tribe by Sebastian Junger. And Junger is a guy who spent a lot of time both in dangerous environments and talking to other people who spend their time in dangerous environments. He wrote The Perfect Storm, he wrote a book called War, where he went to Afghanistan to embed himself with the soldiers there. And he's no stranger to putting himself in places of hardship. And the basic idea that he's trying to get across in this book is that it's very important for our kind of mental and overall well-being to feel like we're part of a group, like we're part of a tribe. And that is something that we have sometimes lost in modern society, and something that we can see benefits people elsewhere. And Junger thinks that there are a whole bunch of factors contributing to this, whether they're an emphasis on what he calls extrinsic values like wealth and status over things like community and togetherness. So one of the key ways he does this is to talk about tribal societies, but also how societies act in times of war or hardship, and how this can often bring them together and actually have beneficial results. And then he points to problems that we have in modern society that are kind of non-existent in tribal societies. Like fraud or stealing from the tribe is punished very harshly in traditional communities. But as you probably know, some of the richest people in modern societies get away with large-scale fraud basically all the time. He talks about the way that being forced to operate under wartime conditions can actually foster a sense of togetherness with the rest of your community that wouldn't necessarily exist under regular circumstances. And he talks a lot about how PTSD is probably triggered at least in part by the kind of jarring transition from being in this kind of close-knit, supportive community to the way modern soldiers are kind of left to their own devices as soon as they get back home. And I don't agree with every part of this book. Bits of it have been criticised for kind of over-romanticising tribal societies and war, for leaving parts out on how some of these societies treat what they regard as the underclass or women in some cases, and maybe for oversimplifying some of the roots of mental health problems. But why I do think this book is super valuable is that it's a reminder that community is super important. This book helped remind me that you do need a tribe. You need people around you that will help you, but also that you feel responsible for helping. I do think that's important for your mental health. I feel like being part of something is important to us humans as social animals. And if you didn't grow up with a tribe, if you don't have strong family ties, then I think building your own tribe, finding people that you can take care of and be responsible for, is one of the most important things you can do for your own well-being as well as theirs. So definitely read Tribe. It's super short, it's really readable. It changed the amount of emphasis I put on speaking to other people and being part of something, and that was really valuable for me. Read Tribe, find your own tribe, take care of yourself and other people. And that is it. Those are 5 books that have had a huge impact on my life. There are certainly others. If there's enough interest, I'll do another one of these videos about them. I would also love to hear about the books that have changed your life. If you have any recommendations, I'm all about the reading. I've done a bunch more videos about reading. Please watch some of them if you're looking for recommendations. In the meantime, go read.